Hello again. Wait, let me adjust my mic levels here. How about now? Okay? Yeah. Sige. So, what are we doing now? As we said in the previous clip, no, we're trying to introduce, or we're trying to, introduce and summarize what exactly the political systems model is, right? So let's write that down. So, what is the political system exactly? Now, in order to do this, we began with the basic question of what the traditional political system entailed. No. So wait, let me adjust this here. Yeah, I hope that works. Okay, so coming back to it, mm, the traditional political system, so ito yung trad, right, was composed of three major parts. You have this, this, and this, right? And when your classmates were asked to identify what these were exactly, they said input, process, output, right? So it's a very traditional systems theory sort of thing. And this is shared by many, many other areas of study, not just political science, but, an input leads to a process, leads to an output. Now, what were the inputs specifically to a traditional political system? You have demands, right? What people want to happen, demands. And then you have support. How many people want this to happen? Do the people who have the power to get this done give their support, or do they decline the support? So, if you have a good mix of a demand that has enough support, it enters the political system, it's processed. So, this is in the traditional sense now. In the traditional sense, we have this is the policy making body or bodies. Kasi multiple levels naman yun, di ba? So, if you have demands, things that you want to happen that have enough support, they enter the policy making bodies and they come out, hopefully, as policies or responses. And we were talking about this earlier that if you think about the Philippine nation state, there are many things you can run through this model, right? What can you run through this model? One example that's very distinct is martial law. Martial law was an output, it was a response, a policy response specifically. Now, interestingly enough, the demands and support for martial law were manufactured or put together by a particular group. In this case, we understand how the president at the time, Ferdinand Marcos, had reasons to push for martial law and why that would be helpful for extending his executive control, right? So, in a way, his demands, wants, had enough support for them to enter the policy making body. There were other things as well. He had presidential powers to do A, B, and C, like declare martial law and put his political opponents in jail. So there are a bunch of things that happened. The policy that comes out is the response. So you can run other things through this as well. Let's think of other examples. Mm, okay, maybe we can think about in more recent years Sogi bill, right? So this is interesting because in a place that is quite conservative, right? You have a set of laws that should now protect people's self identification and how they want to be addressed in terms of their gender identity, right? Which is not just gender identity, a bunch of other things as well. But that's interesting because it means this demand got enough support for it to go into the policymaking process and eventually become a response by the system. Now, how do people react to these responses? How did people react to martial law? How did people react to Saudi? How did people react to a bunch of other policies? Is something that you find in the feedback loop. So this is feedback, right? Feedback. The feedback loop is important because it allows the system to continue existing. Now, there's another aspect to this. This dotted dashed line is the environment. For instance, here's a policy, right? DRRM, Disaster Risk Reduction Management, and the way it was integrated into the national infrastructure actually took a long time. If you look at the history of disaster management in the Philippines, there was a time when we didn't even really make the distinction between natural disasters and, like human disasters, such as um, invasion, for instance, or wartime. Before, it was all just emergency response, not necessarily natural versus human made. Diba? So the fact that we now have a structure for DRRM is a policy response. And it exists within the environment where we're constantly facing one or another national emergency because of our geographic location within the Pacific Ring of Fire and the other, like considerations that come into play when storms pass through the Philippines. So, earthquakes, storms. The Philippines is a country that experiences many natural disasters, and some places experience it more often than others. So, the demand and support for a policy framework that would address and create protocols for disaster response entered the policymaking bodies and were, I want to say pooped out, but okay, they were churned out, right? They were churned out as DRRM. And that's a concrete environment. How about in the case of martial law? What is an environmental factor that helps us explain what was happening at the time? Post World War II, Cold War context, right? The Cold War context with a bipolar world where the communists and the capitalists were trying to build their own spheres of influence. Diba? So that's an environmental context that affects how people make decisions. Now, here's the problem. The traditional political system uh, talks specifically about policies, right? But in our definition of politics, we are looking at power relations and no longer just politics as policies, diba? So here comes the new part then. So I hope you can see this. I tried to turn the light down a little bit, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, okay, so how did we modify this to I no, we're missing one part, sorry. So the assumption of the system is it can continue to survive. It can survive. It is stable, right? So there's a level of stability that actually comes into play when you look at the traditional political system. Now, here's a question I posed to the class earlier today. What would happen for, say, this is the Philippine political system, right? And the post World War II era, the one that we exist in now. What would happen for this system to cease to exist? What would happen for it to collapse entirely? No, save for the apocalypse, of course, we have revolution, right? If a revolution was to happen, and this there's an attempt at government overtake in from the period of 1946 to 1954, I think, for the Hook Rebellion. And then, of course, we have under the current NPA structure from 1969 up until the present day, there's still an ongoing attempt to take over government, right? So, if a revolution happens, this no longer exists or it's recreated as something else entirely. Diba? So the policy making bodies now look different. The demands and support might not be as straightforward. And the policy responses might have a different ideological tone to them, right? So, okay, let's give an example of that, right? Mm, Okay, let's talk about the Cultural Revolution or the Red Revolution in China, right? So when the Red Revolution in China happened in about 1939, we know that when they took over government, they took over everything. They confiscated private property and they redistributed it. So typically, in a society that's not socialist, the government should not be able to just take territory and take property and redistribute it because that belongs to you and your family, right? So, in an old system, theoretically, you could demand that your property be protected under current laws, where that's recognized legally as your property. And that would be supported because there are legal mechanisms for it. But when the legal mechanisms change because the people in power change and what they believe in changes as well, you can't say to the socialist reorganizing your family property, that's mine. Because they do not acknowledge the principle of family property, of inherited property, right? So that's one way in which you see the system transforming completely and the rules of the game change. Right? Okay. So the system is stable until it isn't, until it faces a major challenge, whether warfare or failed state status or even government overtake, and so on and so forth. So it's more complicated than that, but those are the basic contours of it. So now the question is, how did we modify this political system to fit into historical analysis?